We hear a lot about carbon dioxide emissions these days, but the EPA is about to take action against another pollutant, mercury. Every year, mercury emissions from U.S. coal-fired power plants average 47 tons a year. EPA will be rolling out a plan to cut them starting next year. Clean Skies Dan Goldstein has more.
It's one of the most toxic substances known to man. Less than a teaspoon of mercury could contaminate a 20-acre lake. And in recent decades, pregnant women and nursing mothers have been urged not to eat fish because of potential mercury contamination that is blamed for birth defects. The U.S. power industry is responsible for about 40% of the mercury emissions from burning coal. And earlier this month, the Environmental Integrity Project, a group of former EPA lawyers, released a report saying that not only haven't mercury emissions budged in a decade, at the top 25 biggest plants in the U.S., emissions are actually going up.
Despite years of promises, the electric power industry has barely made a dent in its mercury emissions this decade. And this slow progress is nowhere near the levels that would be achieved if all power plants installed the modern pollution controls that are widely available and are already in use at some power plants today.
But environmentalists may have to shoulder some blame too. The Bush administration proposed a mercury cap-and-trade program in 2003. It said the approach could cut emissions to as little as 15 tons by 2018. But shortly after the Bush rule was finalized, environmental groups sued, saying the plan was too weak. And in February 2008, this federal courthouse behind me agreed, throwing out the Bush-era rule and sending the EPA back to the drawing board.
It is a little ironic that someone gets the rule struck down and then complains that mercury emissions are not coming down fast enough.
Jeff Homestead, a former EPA official under the Bush administration who wrote the mercury rule back in 2003, says that environmental groups made a mistake in challenging their plan. Not only were companies already moving to comply with the upcoming cap-and-trade program, he said, the court's decision in 2008 to have the EPA start all over again just meant no direction from the federal government.
To bank against that cap, people start to reduce their emissions right away. So we've lost significant reductions over the years because the same groups that issued this report were involved in challenging and striking down the room. So that is a disappointment.
Even without a mercury rule from Washington, operators of coal-fired power plants like Southern Company and Luminant, signaled out by the EIP report as some of the worst emitters, are already investing billions in scrubbing technology to combat pollutants. Homestead says while these fixes are aimed at cutting nitrogen oxide and sulfur dioxide emissions, they'll also reduce mercury emissions too.
Many companies are putting on technology that have the effect of controlling mercury, but they're putting those technologies on primarily because they get reductions in other pollutants that are actually a much more serious issue.
That's still not good enough, say other environmental groups. They're anticipating a stronger rule from EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson later this year, who in one of her first acts in 2009 decided not to appeal the court decision. Instead, EPA will issue specific limits for plants with deadlines for reductions.
The rule is going to come out in 2011. The cuts will take effect no later than 2014. So we actually think that the cuts are coming a lot sooner under the Clean Air Act as written, as opposed to the rule that the Bush administration wanted to promulgate instead of implementing the Clean Air Act.
That's what worries Jeff Homestead.
It's not going to be cap and trade. It'll be some sort of plant by plant, which causes problems because, you know, there's some plants that are just configured very differently. So I think it is fair to say that the power generation sector is quite nervous about the likely cost of this rule, but nobody really knows because it won't be proposed until early next year.
Despite a drop in coal use last year by power plants, down from 50% on average to less than 45% in 2009, mercury emissions both this year and last aren't expected to show similar reductions. And the EPA says it won't be until November of 2011 before its new rule is finally in place, almost a decade after the agency decided to tackle mercury emissions the first time around. In Washington, Dan Goldstein, Clean Skies News.
EPA declined comment for our story, but said that its new mercury regulations would be comprehensive and include emissions across a variety of industrial sectors.